but just to lead into that, title of a talk, Sharon's not here, so I can say it: Lies, Lies and Damn Lies. Sharon would tell me off for swearing afterwards if she was here, but no, it is a scriptural word, and it actually means to be cut off or to be judged. Now, certain lies will take you, they can actually kill a person, and we know that from the Garden of Eden experience. And when I went to high school, and particularly if you've gone through high school in a Western nation, you would have been taught the theory of evolution, and it's still what they call a theory because it hasn't been proven. And all clever lies are actually mixed in with the truth. And when you go to school, 90+% of what they teach you is all good. You know, the mathematics, the physics, the chemistry, and the English and history and all of that, it's generally all good. But they've slipped something into biology, and it's a really critical thing, because basically what the theory of evolution says that we all come from random events and mutations that's happened over sort of millions of years period. And basically it rules out God, and that's not good at all. And seemingly, you know, when we're fairly young and naive, you know, because it's mixed in with the truth, we tend to swallow these things. And I certainly did when I went through the education system, because I was looking for answers to the big questions: the why, the wherefore, the purpose, and that sort of thing. And I was taught these things, and I saw there's a little chart, you know, the slug that develops into, you know, the lizard, the crocodile, you know, the dog, the horse, and the human, and it all looked pretty good. Oh yeah, you know, I can see that, it's all happening, and I swallowed this hook, line and sinker. But when I received the Holy Spirit, I knew God was real, and I knew the Bible was God's word, and I started to read, well, God claims responsibility for creation. Now, it's all based upon a book that Darwin wrote back in the 1860s called Origin of Species and Through Natural Selection. And it's interesting, he called it Origin of Species, not the origins of life, because he had this thing about sort of natural selection and how that actually sort of determined sort of variations within a species. And this is something which is not new at all, because we've been doing, as people, selective breeding for thousands of years. And the original wheats and barleys, they were all from sort of native grasses in the Middle East and elsewhere, and they were selectively bred to produce sort of quantity and quality of grain. And pretty much everything in all our livestock, they have been selectively bred. And I was across in Africa a number of years ago, and I saw a herd of goats. And I thought there's something different about sort of a few of those goats. And they were actually sheep, and they look so much like goats, I couldn't believe it. Yet you come to Australia and they're all really woolly, and they look like a completely different animal. Why? Because they've been selectively bred to produce a lot of wool and sort of quality meat and that sort of thing. And horses, they've been bred, you know, it's a very different beast, a sort of stallion thoroughbred to, you know, sort of working horse in Mongolia and that sort of thing. And the dog's a classic example. It all comes from the common dog, the mutt, if you like. And we've got all these different breeds of tiny little things up to those great big dogs, what are they called? Great Danes. And it all comes from the common dog. So it's within that species. And God has put this amount of variation through selective breeding. And the natural selection is just environmental conditions channel this breeding. And what it's actually saying is, one example is if you've got a population of horses and then you get a lot of predators move in, and they start to decimate the horses. The ones that survive are the ones that are going to run faster. So you get these fast horses, they survive, and then they breed up, and it enhances the speed gene within the horses. But Darwin makes this quantum leap that sort of because of these sort of developments and sort of mutations, it can lead to new species. And so he purposely didn't go down the road to try and explain life, because he couldn't do it. Now, I want to quote you something Darwin said. He didn't write this in his book, but it was in his notes. And when someone was asking him about, well, how did it actually happen from non-living matter goes to living matter? Explain the process. How do you explain this? And this is what he wrote. He said, but if, now brackets here, and oh, what a big if. We could conceive that some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and sort of phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex change. At present, such matter would be instantly devoured and absorbed, which would have not have been the case before living creatures were formed. So he just talks about this muddy pond, and in the right conditions, if all the right components were there, a bit of electricity maybe, sort of not a lightning strike. It's a bit like Frankenstein's monster. You know how the monsters stitch together and they wait for the electrical storm and the electrodes, and the lightning comes down and energizes and the corpse starts to smoke and then it opens its eyes. That's pure fiction, just as much as this is pure fiction, the muddy pond. And ever since then, scientists have tried to duplicate the muddy pond, and they can get the right ingredients in the muddy pond, so the amino acids and the proteins and bits and pieces, the basic compounds for the living cell, but they can never bring life from that because it just doesn't happen that way. There's two camps of thought in science. One is biogenesis, and basically this group of scientists say that life can only come from life. So living matter brings forth living matter. And then there's the other group, which sort of abiogenesis, and they say that life can come from non-living matter. Well, we'll just go to John chapter 1 and we'll just look what the Bible has to say about this. John chapter 1 is the equivalent to the book of Genesis chapter 1 in the Old Testament. John 1 in the New Testament explains the beginnings and the genesis of these things, and it's talking about the Lord Jesus Christ. Here in verse 3 it says, all things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men, or the beacon to mankind. So he is the origins of life, and life has only come from him. Everything that we see around us has come from the Lord, and he claims responsibility. Yet this other theory goes down another road and says, no, it all happened. Sort of all happened by chance and sort of random events. So it's a really interesting thing. And the theory of evolution has got that many holes in it. You could drive a Mack truck through it. It really has. And they've tried to sort of go back and to authenticate it, but they can't, because you can't bring life from non-living matter. And back in the early 1950s, 1952 I think it was, they had these sort of scientists, and they made this controlled environment, and it was like the muddy pond, and they had sort of chemicals there and the electricity going through it. And they produce the basic components, or the chemicals, which you find in the common cell or the simple cell. And it was in Time magazine. The next year it's in textbooks, and it's been taught, to sort of children going through the education system as this proves evolution. No, it proves the manufacture of the basic components, but it's a long way distant from the living cell, which is incredibly complex, coming out the other end. We'll go back to the book of Genesis, just in Genesis chapter 1. Now, this covers probably millions of years, possibly billions of years, possibly thousands of years. We don't really know. But this is the 6 periods of creation in the beginning. Now we'll just pick it up in verse 11. This is the first record of living matter being produced. It says, and God said, let the earth bring forth grass, and the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth, and it was so. Verse 12, and the earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after its kind, and God saw that it was good. And that was on the 3rd day, or the 3rd period of time of creation. Now there's words in there which we need to drill down into. Kind, it says that it 4 times it brought forth after its own kind. The Hebrew word, and it means species. So God created the species of the vegetation. And they've got these boundaries or these parameters, and there is a bit of variation, just like the dog. You know, you can sort of selectively breed the big dog and the small dog and everything in between, but basically it doesn't jump from species to species. No matter how much you mutate the genes, it will not change. It will bring forth after its own kind. And just in verse 12 there it says, whose seed is in itself. Now, this word seed actually comes from the Hebrew word means posterity, and that actually means its future generation is in itself. And they wouldn't have understood this, and they wouldn't have understood this for thousands of years, but now we can drill down and look into the cell, and you see the DNA, and you see the program, and that all these things are pre-programmed in it, and life comes from life, and that's what the Bible teaches us. So that's the plant life. We'll go to verse 20 of the same chapter. Now, this happened on the fifth day, or the fifth period of time. It says, and God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and the fowl that may fly upon the earth, and the open firmament of heaven. And God created great whales. Now, that's an interesting word. In the Hebrew, it means great land and sea monsters. Now, if you didn't know the word dinosaur, how would you explain a dinosaur? Great land and sea monsters? Fits, doesn't it? So these are probably sort of the reptile sort of form of creation, the crocodiles and everything else in the bird life, and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind, and God saw that it was good. Note the emphasis on after his kind, after his species, all right? Yes, there's variation within a species, but it can't cross over. You know, you can get two fairly similar species, say you get a horse and a donkey. They're similar and they can breed up, and they produce what's called a mule, and they selectively breed mules because they've got a good temperament and work ethic and that sort of thing. But a mule is sterile, so you can put a male mule with a female mule and they can't breed because they can't go without the boundaries, because they're not of that kind. There is no mule species. All right, so it can't digress too far from these things. And they can breed a lion with a tiger. They call it a liger. Again, it's sterile. You know, it can't reproduce. It cannot bring forth after its own kind. Right, the final one, so we've had the plant life and we've had the reptiles, you know, so possibly the dinosaurs, the cold-blooded animals, and perhaps the bird life. We're in verse 24. And it says, and God said, let the earth bring forth a living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, and the beast of the earth after his kind, the warm-blooded sort of mammals perhaps. And it was so, and God made the beast of the earth after his kind, the cattle after their kind, and every thing that creepeth upon the earth after his kind, and God saw that it was good. And he made sort of men and women on the sixth period of time also. So here we've got the sort of three stages of creation according to the scriptures, but it covers possibly millions of years, you know. And back in Darwin's time, it was about the 1860s, and the magnification that they could have was about 1,200 times, I think that was the maximum. So they could look down into the microscope, and, you know, they regarded a cell as a simple cell. You know, it was a bit like a sort of poached egg. It had, the cell wall, and I think they call it sort of cytoplasm and the nucleus, and they just, thought it was a very simple thing, and you get the basic chemicals and components, and you sort of put it in one end, and this simple cell should just form. Now, time has gone on, technology and some microscopes and that sort of thing. No matter, the further we've looked into heaven with a telescope, and the further we've looked down into sort of the micro stuff with a microscope, we just see design, we see creation, we see all these things, you know, and it's just the handiwork of God. So they've gone right down into the simple cell, and it's anything but simple. And we're going to see a video about the simple cell and what actually takes place in the simple cell. Now, while you've been here today, you've probably 2 billion of your cells have died and they've replicated, right? So what we're about to see is happening in you and I right now. And we've got no control over this. This is just automatically happening. And this is a function of the simple cell. And it's a bit like the car maker. You've got this big automotive sort of car factory, and in the back door is going in the raw materials, you know, and just imagine all the machinery, the refinery, the design and all that sort of stuff, the components getting put together. The front door pops out this brand new, say, Mercedes four-wheel drive, nice and shiny and just sort of purring away. And that's what's happening inside the cell, but on a lot more complex way. And it's just all happening inside, and it's an absolute miracle what's happening inside. So we'll go to the first video if we can, and just have a quick look at that if we're ready. Maybe dim the lights, yep.
Physical nature of DNA, and it's these two strands that run in opposite directions for reasons I can't go into right now, but they physically run in opposite directions, which creates a number of complications for your living cells, as you're about to see, most particularly when DNA is being copied. And so what I'm about to show you is an accurate representation of the actual DNA replication machine that's occurring right now inside your body, at least 2002 biology. So DNA is entering the production line from the left-hand side, and it hits this collection, this miniature biochemical machines that are pulling apart the DNA strand and making an exact copy. So DNA comes in, it hits this blue donut-shaped structure, and it's ripped apart into its two strands. One strand can be copied directly, and it can be seen spooling off down to the bottom there. But things aren't so simple for the other strand because it must be copied backwards. So it's thrown out repeatedly in these loops and copied one section at a time, creating two new DNA molecules. Now, you have billions of this machine right now whirring the right way inside you, copying your DNA with exquisite fidelity. It's an accurate representation, and it's pretty much at the correct speed for what it's occurring inside you. But I've left out error correction and a bunch of other things. This was work from a number of years ago. Thank you. This is work from a number of years ago, but what I want to show you next is updated science. It's updated technology. So again, we begin with DNA, and it's jiggling and wiggling there because of the surrounding supermolecules, which I've stripped away so you can see something. DNA is about 2 nanometers across, which is really quite tiny. But in each one of your cells, each strand of DNA is about 30 to 40 million nanometers long. So to keep the DNA organized, to regulate access to the genetic code, it's wrapped around these purple proteins. I've labeled them purple here. It's packaged up and bundled up. All of its field of view is a single strand of DNA. This huge package of DNA is called a chromosome, and we'll come back to chromosomes in a minute. We're pulling out, we're zooming out through a nuclear pore, which is sort of the gateway to this compartment that holds all the DNA called the nucleus. All of this field of view is about a semester's worth of biology, and I've got 7 minutes, so we're not going to be able to do that today. No, I'm being told no. This is the way a living cell looks down a light microscope, and it's been filmed under time-lapse, which is why you can see it moving. The nuclear envelope breaks down. These sausage-shaped things are the chromosomes, and we'll focus on them. They go through this very striking motion that is focused on these little red spots. When the cell feels it's ready to go, it rips apart the chromosome. One set of DNA goes to one side, the other side gets the other set of DNA, identical copies of DNA, and then the cell splits down the middle. And again, you have billions of cells undergoing this process right now inside of you. Now we're going to rewind and just focus on the chromosomes and look at its structure and describe it. So again, here we are at that equator moment. The chromosomes line up, and if we isolate just one chromosome, we're going to pull it out and have a look at its structure. So this is one of the biggest molecular structures that you have, at least as far as we've discovered so far, inside of us. So this is a single chromosome, and you have 2 strands of DNA in each chromosome. One is bundled up into one sausage, the other strand is bundled up into the other sausage. These things that look like whiskers that are sticking out from either side are the dynamic scaffolding of the cell. They're called microtubules, but name's not so important. But what we're going to focus on is this red region. I've labeled it red here, and it's the interface between the dynamic scaffolding and the chromosomes. It is obviously central to the movement of the chromosomes. We have no idea really, as to how it's achieving that movement. We've been studying this thing called the kinetochore for over 100 years with intense study, and we're still just beginning to discover what it's all about. It is made up of about 200 different types of proteins, thousands of proteins in total. It is a signal broadcasting system. It broadcasts through chemical signals, telling the rest of the cell when it's ready, when it feels that everything is aligned and ready to go for the separation of the chromosomes. It is able to couple onto the growing and shrinking microtubules. It's transiently, it's involved with the growing of the microtubules, and it's able to transiently couple onto them. It's also a tension sensing system. It's able to feel when the cell is ready, when the chromosome is correctly positioned. It's turning green here because it feels that everything is just right. And you'll see that there's one little last bit that's still remaining red. And it's walked away down the microtubules. That is the signal broadcasting system sending out the stop signal, and it's walked away. I mean, it's that mechanical. It's molecular clockwork. This is how you work at the molecular scale. So with a little bit of molecular eye candy, we've got kinesins, which are the orange ones. They're little molecular courier molecules walking one way. And here are the dynein. They're carrying that broadcasting system, and they've got their long legs so they can step around obstacles and so on. So again, this is all derived accurately from the science. The problem is we can't show it to you any other way.
Now, I didn't understand much of that, but so what I got from it was it's very complex, and that's happening inside you and I, so right as we sit here. And it's just a wonder of creation. Now, we're burning quite a bit of time here. Right, so there's a lot of holes in natural selection being responsible for all life on the planet. And we're just going to watch another video because so natural selection suggests that every mutation has to be advantageous for that generation right there and now. If it's not, then it's not, it doesn't sort of push the whole thing forward, sort of natural selection. So this next video, I think you may have seen this. Someone said that it's been on before, but it just shows another aspect that there's a lot of components in creation which are not really beneficial for the survival of that generation, but they're there, and you've got to ask the question why. Now, I was going to read out sort of quotes about sort of the DNA and that sort of thing, and it's all it's like a computer code that is written in the cell, and it's really detailed, and sort of Bill Gates says it's more complicated than any sort of software sort of program, and that's all inside of our cell, So the background to all of this is incredibly complicated, and it just doesn't fit with random events and mutations. So we'll go to the next video if we could.
There are at least 8 million different species of animals and plants. And for more than a century, the go-to explanation for their incredible diversity has been the theory of natural selection. Charles Darwin's hypothesis of gradual, undirected biological change has had enormous influence on both science and philosophy. Yet can a purely materialistic process actually account not only for the stunning variety of living organisms, but also for their extravagant beauty?
I think the place to start with natural selection and beauty is Darwin himself. He wrote once that every time he saw the tail of a peacock, it made him physically ill, sick to his stomach, because he's looking at something that goes well beyond what his theories, either of natural selection or sexual selection, can explain.
To better understand Darwin's concerns about beauty, peacocks, and their threat to his theory, let's take a closer look at those feathers.
You see the peacock's tail and you go, wow. It's a visual crescendo of symmetry, harmony, coordination among all the elements of the design. And the deeper you look, the more interesting it becomes.
An adult male peacock has, on average, about 200 individual tail feathers. 170 of them feature a decorative eye spot, and 30 are crowned with a wing-shaped plume called a T. When displayed during courtship, the feathers form a magnificent fan, where every eye spot and T are uniformly spaced and geometrically balanced to create a showcase of pattern, symmetry, precision, and design.
This bird is a living, breathing work of art. And when we move in close to the details, we see craftsmanship and planning and subtle engineering that's just utterly obvious.
The shape of every eye spot is defined by rows of multicolored branching strands called barbs. Moving closer, we see that each barb contains thousands of barbules, microscopic filaments tightly compacted along a rigid shaft. And the surface of each barbule is segmented into crystal-like bands of molecular jewelry. These barbules are reflective, so they glimmer and change color when struck by light from different angles.
The total effect of all this decoration provides an excellent example of what is known as gratuitous beauty. That's beauty that goes way beyond what's needed to attract a mate or to provide some other survival advantage. In other words, you have features that look like they're there for no other reason than to be gorgeous, to be beautiful, to be breathtaking.
In nature, gratuitous beauty is not limited to peacocks, for the animal and plant kingdoms are filled with striking visual displays that each evokes an obvious question. Is artistry of this magnitude actually possible through natural selection, a blind process devoid of foresight or purpose, that theoretically constructed every detail in every organism through a series of biological accidents, random errors in the genetic code?
No, because randomness by definition is going nowhere in particular. So the method of explanation, the tools of explanation that natural selection gives us are far too crude for what they need to explain. Give me an example of chaos and chance producing beauty, and I'll rethink it. But what I see chaos and chance producing is more chaos and chance.
To better grasp the artistic limitations of natural selection, consider the planning, imagination, and skill required to create one of the most famous paintings in history, Michelangelo's mural on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel.
Looking at the ceiling, you have a coherent story. There is a unifying thread of biblical themes that brings it all together. There are symmetries in the way that things have been painted and arranged. The use of the space, the way that figures stand at particular intervals in relation to each other. And you see exquisite brushwork over this enormous surface. Just this overflow of artistic genius. It's the antithesis of randomness. In the Sistine Chapel, randomness would be a bucket of paint accidentally kicked over and splattered on a wall. Or a bunch of stains, right? Flaking paint. The ceiling's coming down. We got to get Michelangelo in here to fix this mess. We have randomness and Michelangelo, and they are polar opposites.
Similar principles hold true in nature. If the random genetic mutations so essential to natural selection have no eye for blending colors or ability to formulate elegant patterns and shapes, then there must be some other agent responsible for the glorious petals of a lily and the ornate decorations on a butterfly's wing. A designer whose works far exceed the constraints of Charles Darwin's survival of the fittest.
What we see in beautiful systems are features that go beyond what's necessary for mere survival. So for me, ultimately, beauty points to design because in a biological context, beauty is an extra. It's an add-on. Beauty is there over and above what's needed just to make a go of it. Well, you start walking along that path, and it doesn't take very long until you realize you come to grips with the reality that there was a transcendent mind that put this universe together as we find it. What we have right in front of us, in the peacock, in tropical fish, in the eye of the eagle, in these exquisite designs that show not just engineering, but artistry, whimsy, humor, subtlety, all the features of a supreme intellect. And the final point, the one that really brings it home, is this idea of beauty, of a property that we perceive, that we understand, that we feel, that we respond to, that goes well beyond what living things need just to get by. That signal carries us beyond the world itself to a cause that's transcendent, to a cause that's divine. The world is designed. It's the only reasonable thing to infer from what we see.
Okay, I just want to read one scripture in closing, and it's in Romans chapter 1. For most of us, sort of evolution is not a problem. We just don't believe it. It's just, it's a sort of fairy tale. But if you go through the education system, you are going to be challenged along these lines. So we just want to let people know there are a lot of answers out there, and there's a lot of holes in the whole theory. It just doesn't add up. It doesn't stack up. And what's actually happened is people have embraced it, because if they embrace that, they don't have to believe in God. Now, we're just in Romans chapter 1 and perhaps verse 20. I'll just sort of read it to you. It says, "For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." And what it's really saying is God is manifest through the creation. We just see it, and it's brilliant. It's breathtaking, the beauty, the wonder, the design, the art for art's sake sort of thing. And it says that we should see God when we see the creation. But verse 21 says, here's the problem, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God. So they didn't recognize him as God, so neither were thankful, but became vain or empty in their imagination, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Now, I've spoken to sensible, logical thinking people, and they just can't see, the intelligent sort of design side of things, and they would rather believe this. And it's like this blindness, this darkness has come upon them because of their unbelief. And this is the way it's going to be, and it's probably going to get worse before the trumpet sounds. But we just need to know that there's a lot of things which just don't add up in a million years. If anyone wants to read a good book which explains a lot of the DNA and the RNA and the complexity and the design of it all, there's one called The Signature of the Cell by Stephen Meyer, and that's a good read. And I read it, but don't ask me questions, because there was lots of pictures though, and whenever I read a book, I like pictures. All right, so it's all good. All right, well, we'll say amen to it. Yeah, we've gone over time. So if we can have our singers back.